It feels like every time you turn around, there's a new graphics card on the market, right?
Yeah,
It's seriously tough to keep up with.
I know what you mean. It's hard to figure out which ones are actually worth your hard-earned cash.
Oh.
All these new releases. It can be overwhelming.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, let's get right into it. We're looking at a recent benchmark that compared two really popular cards. AMD's Radeon RX 970 XT and Nvidia's GeForce RTX 5070 Ti.
And this wasn't just some quick comparison, right? They tested a whopping 55 different games.
That's a ton.
Yeah, they ran all those games at both 1440p and 4K. So a seriously comprehensive look at how these cards actually perform.
And this comes at a really interesting time, too. AMD's been making some pretty bold claims about their market share. Like, there are reports that they've shipped something like 200,000 of those 970 XTs already.
Wow.
Yeah, and AMD Japan's even claiming they've hit a 45% market share.
That's a huge chunk of the market. Though we always have to be careful with those self-reported numbers, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. But then there's this other claim, and this one's even more interesting to me. They're saying that AMD has actually sold more GPUs in their entire 9070 series than Nvidia has of their entire GeForce 50 series.
Seriously. Now, that is a big deal, especially since Nvidia usually gets their new cards out earlier in the year.
That's what makes it so surprising. And apparently, part of the reason is that Nvidia's cards have been really hard to find.
Oh yeah, availability has been a real issue for Nvidia lately.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic because that means more competition for them.
And potentially better prices and availability for us.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to really dive into today. Let's cut through the marketing hype and figure out how these cards perform in the real world.
Love that. No marketing fluff, just straight facts.
You got it. And of course, the big question is, which one's actually better?
Right. Which one gives you more bang for your buck?
So before we jump into the game-by-game breakdown, there was one thing the source mentioned that I wanted to address. Apparently, the RX 970 XT's suggested retail price is actually closer to the RTX 5070, not the 5070 Ti.
Yeah, I saw that too. But the source actually didn't recommend the RTX 5070 at all.
Exactly. They basically said the 5070 Ti is just the better option.
So it makes sense to compare the 970 XT to the 5070 Ti, even if the price difference isn't quite as dramatic.
Exactly. All right, so let's get into some specific games. This is where things get really interesting. In certain games, there were some really noticeable differences between the two cards.
Yeah, some games definitely favored one card over the other.
Like Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced, the 970 XT was actually significantly slower in that one.
Oh yeah, that was a pretty big difference, like around 29% slower at 1440p.
Ouch. And it was even slower at 4K.
Yeah, about 24%. Kind of makes you wonder if it's a driver thing, you know? Especially since it's an older DirectX 11 game.
That's a good point.
Like maybe Nvidia's drivers are just better optimized for those older games.
That's a possibility. And it wasn't just Grand Theft Auto. There were a few other games where the 970 XT really struggled.
Like Assetto Corsa Competizione.
Oh, yeah.
That one, the 970 XT was like 35% slower at 1440p and 37% slower at 4K.
Ouch. And Hunt Showdown was pretty bad, too.
Yeah, 35% at 1440p and 39% at 4K.
Wow. So in those specific games, Nvidia had a pretty clear lead.
For sure. But there were also games where the 970 XT actually came out on top.
Oh yeah, for sure. There were some pretty surprising wins for AMD.
Take Rocket League, for example. The 970 XT was way faster in that one.
Yeah, by like 41% at 1440p and 36% at 4K. That's a huge difference.
It's almost like there might be a driver issue on Nvidia's side for that game. You know?
Yeah, you'd almost have to think so to see a gap that big. And then there's Space Marine too.
Oh yeah, that was another win for AMD.
The 970 XT was 17% faster at 1440p, and then a whopping 36% faster at 4K.
Yeah, and I think Nvidia even acknowledged that there are some performance issues with their cards in that game.
Interesting.
It just goes to show that game-specific optimizations can really shake things up.
Totally. So there were those outliers, and then there were a bunch of games where the two cards were pretty much neck and neck.
Yeah, those were the really close battles.
Like in Counter-Strike 2, the 970 XT was only about 10% slower at 1440p and 13% at 4K.
Yeah, pretty close. And Marvel Rivals was a tight race too, with the 970 XT lagging just slightly behind.
Right, and even in a really demanding game like Black Myth Wukong, they were still pretty close in performance.
Yeah, with ray tracing turned off, the 970 XT was only about 6% behind at 1440p and 10% at 4K. Not a huge difference there.
Exactly. And we saw similar results in Kingdom Come Deliverance, War Thunder in DX12 mode. Even in F124 with ray tracing on, they were basically tied.
Yeah, it was kind of surprising to see the 970 XT hold its own against Nvidia in a ray trace game like that.
I know. And then there were even some games where AMD actually took the lead, like Bright Memory, Infinite, Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, Horizon Forbidden West, and Warhammer 3.
That's right.
So you had those outliers on both sides, but then a bunch of games where they were super close.
It really was all over the map, depending on the game.
Yeah, it really highlights how important it is to look at the specific games you play the most when you're choosing a card.
Absolutely. But let's zoom out a bit. What's the big picture when we look at all 55 games together?
That's the real question, right?
So, averaging the performance across all those games, the 970 XT was about 5% slower than the 5070 Ti.
Okay, that's not too bad.
And the really interesting thing is that for about 65% of the games, the difference between the two cards was less than 10%.
So in most games, they're actually pretty similar in terms of performance.
Yeah, and the source made a point of saying that those outliers we talked about, like Rocket League and those few games where the 970 XT really struggled, they were the main reason the overall average was 5%.
Right, so the big takeaway there is that in most games, they're pretty comparable.
Yeah, for sure.
But, of course, performance isn't the only thing that matters, right?
Definitely not. Price is a huge factor, and availability too.
Exactly. So let's talk about price. The 970 XT has an MSRP of $600, while the 5070 Ti is $750.
That's a $250 difference right there.
Yeah, which on paper makes the 970 XT look like a much better deal.
But as we all know, MSRPs don't always tell the whole story.
Especially these days with GPUs being so hard to find at their suggested prices. So what did they actually find in terms of real-world prices?
Well, at the time they did the benchmark, the 970 XT was selling for around $750.
Okay, so a bit higher than MSRP.
Yeah, and the 5070 Ti was going for about $900.
So still a pretty significant difference.
Yeah, about $150.
And they even gave some examples from Australia, where the 970 XT was around 1,400 Australian dollars, and the 5070 Ti was closer to 1,700.
That's a pretty big saving.
Yeah, but the source was really clear about this. They said, don't buy at inflated prices. If you can, wait for prices to get closer to MSRP.
Absolutely. It's worth being patient.
Totally. And the other thing they mentioned was availability. Apparently, the 970 XT was much easier to find than the 5070 Ti.
Oh, yeah, that's a big deal, too. If you can't even find the card you want, it doesn't really matter what the price is.
Exactly. And that feeds into their recommendation about pricing. They said for the 970 XT to be a clear winner, it needs to be at least 15% cheaper than the 5070 Ti.
Yeah, I saw that.
Why 15%?
Well, they said if it's only like 10% cheaper, then it really just comes down to which games you play.
Because they perform so similarly in a lot of games.
Exactly. But if it's less than 10%, then maybe the extra features of the 5070 Ti start to look more appealing.
Got it. So it's all about finding that sweet spot.
For sure.
All right, so beyond raw performance and price, let's talk about some of the other key differences between these two cards, like upscaling technology.
Oh, yeah. That's becoming a really big deal.
Especially with games getting more demanding every year. So what do they say about AMD's FSR and Nvidia's DLSS?
Well, AMD just released their new FSR4 technology, and apparently it's pretty impressive.
Really?
Yeah, the image quality is supposed to be really good, even better than their old FSR3.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, and they said it's actually somewhere between DLSS 3 and the upcoming DLSS 4 in terms of image quality.
So it's closing the gap with Nvidia.
Definitely. But there's a catch.
What's that?
Well, right now, not that many games support FSR4. DLSS has been around for longer, so it has way more game support.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so for FSR to really compete, they need to get it into more games.
Totally. So another big one, ray tracing performance. Nvidia's always had the lead there, right?
Yeah, traditionally they have.
So has AMD caught up at all?
They're getting there. The 970 XT is a good bit faster than their previous top-end card, the 7900 XTX.
Okay, how much faster are we talking?
Like 26% faster in some of the really demanding ray tracing games.
Wow, that's a decent improvement.
Yeah, and in those super demanding games, it was actually pretty competitive with the 5070 Ti.
So it's not a total wash for AMD anymore.
No, not at all. But across a wider range of games, the 970 XT was still about 20% slower on average.
So Nvidia still has the edge overall.
Yeah, I'd say so.
But the good news is that even if you're into ray tracing, the 970 XT is still a viable option now.
Absolutely, especially with FSR helping to boost performance.
So taking everything into account, what's the final verdict? What should people actually do when they're trying to choose between these two cards?
Honestly, the best advice is to look at the specific games you play and see how each card performs in those games.
Because that's what really matters in the end.
Exactly. Like if you mostly play games where the 5070 Ti is way faster, then maybe that's the card for you.
Especially if those games are really important to you.
Right. But if you play a wider variety of games where they perform more similarly, or if the 970 XT is significantly cheaper, then that could be a better choice.
And don't forget about FSR.
Oh yeah, that's becoming a real game changer for AMD.
Especially if they can get more games to support it.
For sure.
And the other thing to remember is that driver updates can always shake things up.
That's true. You never know when a driver update might boost performance in a certain game.
Yeah, so it's kind of a moving target.
For sure. Oh, and one last thing. The source mentioned that they didn't really look at power consumption or thermals in this benchmark.
Right. They said to check other reviews for that.
Yeah, especially if you're concerned about things like noise and heat.
Totally. So to sum up this deep dive, both the 970 XT and the 5070 Ti are really great cards. They both offer excellent performance in most games.
Yeah, it's really a close race.
The 970 XT tends to be a bit slower, but it's also more available right now, and potentially a better value if you can find it at a good price.
Right, but the 5070 Ti does have the edge in features like ray tracing and DLSS.
So it really comes down to your individual needs and preferences.
Absolutely.
Which leads to a question for you, our listener. Based on everything we've talked about, which card do you think is the right choice for you? And what might make you change your mind in the future?
It's definitely something to think about.
It sure is. And that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you in the next deep dive.
See ya.